Hi everyone, welcome to episode 19 of Food Culture Curious. On this episode, we have my friend Andrea Hinojosa, who's a registered dietitian, and she shares with us about her Bolivian cultural foods and traditions. She goes into some very interesting topics such as witchcraft and functional medicine, fat phobia and diet culture, and in some instances where people may not want to identify with the Latino food culture. It's all very interesting. I hope you enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome to Food Culture Curious. My name is Areli. I'm a registered dietitian on a mission to help healthcare providers be more culturally inclusive in their nutrition recommendations. With us today, we have Andrea Hinojosa, MS, RDN, LDN, CLC. She was born in La Paz, Bolivia, and grew up in Chicagoland area. Andrea is a Latina, queer, health at every size dietitian and lactation counselor who is dedicated to accessible care, and she specializes in eating disorders, perinatal nutrition, pediatric nutrition, integrative functional nutrition, and mental health nutrition. Today, she's going to talk to us all about her food culture. Welcome, Andrea.
Hello, thank you for having me. We finally got the mic to work too. So I'm so happy.
That's okay. That's what I get for trying to be fancy with my new mic.
That's okay. I'm the same way that I'm like, it's probably something on my end. But thank you for having me.
Yeah, of course. So go ahead and tell us a little bit about, what food cultures you identify with. If more than one, that's great too.
Yeah, of course. So for me, I think food cultures that I identify with in the broad spectrum here, I would say anything that falls under Latino kind of just culture and food. So yeah, food cultures I identify would just be any kind of Latino foods, but in more particular, anything that is under Bolivia, because that's where I was born and that's kind of how I just grew up. But I guess the reason I also am broad is because in many ways I grew up with family all over, and I have family like all over the world, but in the US, not so much. And Chicago is so diverse that my community became my family. So I grew up in at one point in a Polish area. So a lot of Polish food became very close to me. I grew up with a family that we were very close to a lot of the Middle Eastern kind of cultures from Palestine to Iraq to Egypt, that a lot of those foods became very close to me, and then actual family members from blood per se, whatever, who basically taught me other food cultures from different places that I didn't know I had family in. So in many ways, I feel like food is part of, in a weird way, part of my identity in that sense, because there's so much culture to it, but there's nothing that feels more home than any kind of just like typical Bolivian dish. That is actually very hard sometimes to find, but recently I was told there are some Bolivian restaurant owners. There's one restaurant in Aurora in Illinois, and then there's one in Chicago that's owned by a Bolivian family, and that's kind of all I know so far out of Illinois. But most Bolivians are in LA, New York, Virginia, so even Texas. So I'm clearly not in the state where I should be at. So I always try to travel and find other Bolivians around because that feels the most home to me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would love to learn more about the Bolivian food culture. Tell me a little bit about some typical proteins, produce, and starches.
I think some typical proteins and starches, produce. Honestly, quinoa is from Bolivia, and a lot of people don't know about that. And I think working as a dietitian, a lot of times people would see that and be like, "Oh, you eat so healthy," and I'll be like, "No, this is just what I grew up with." And so, yeah, I think a lot of people don't know about that. And so, quinoa has like this whole marketing side on it of a superfood, a healthy food, like the everything food. And to me, I just see it as quinoa, and it's a very typical grain that we use that is packed with a lot of protein in it. So from a nutrition perspective, yeah, I see it a lot used, but from a cultural perspective, I think there's just something about it that's very home to me. We're also very different than a lot of my Central America friends who are very big on beans. We are more big on potato. So we're very big on potato, and instead of tortilla, like many of my friends in Central America, we're actually very big on rice. And so rice and potato is a huge, huge kind of thing that I would eat all the time and every day and in different ways. Bolivia has over like 100 varieties of different potatoes, some that you don't actually have access here in the US, or you might have to go to a specialty store or even go out of state. So there are certain food items that I know I would only be able to get if I go to New York or DC, Virginia, or LA. And so for that, some of the food items we just don't have, that we have to adjust our recipes, which is probably why you don't see a lot of Bolivian restaurants in the US. A lot of our dishes are just unique in that way. And they all sometimes have stories that go with the dishes. Produce, because historically of how different Bolivia is, you can basically be in a tropical rainforest, or you can all of a sudden be in something so cold, like up on the mountains. Your produce varies, and a lot of times people are eating vegetarian kind of style dishes, and meat is seen almost as a privilege. So for that reason alone, sometimes you'll see the same dish and the only difference is they have meat versus the other ones, like a vegetarian version of it, where they use some kind of produce to substitute. But I think our common ones other than that are pretty typical to a lot of other Latino countries. When we think about our fruits, we're very big on fruit as well. If we think about our drinks, if we think about lettuce, carrots, our salads, they're still very rich. Seafood, we have the Lake Titicaca that's by our country, and everyone's big on seafood in that area. Ceviche also, but our ceviche is definitely different than, you know, Mexico or Peru. I think anyone who's Boliviano who's listening to this might hate me for saying this, but I think Peru does have better ceviche than Bolivia. But that's, other than that, I'm gonna just say it out loud and say Bolivia has more of the staples and is better. But obviously they're our neighbor, and so Peru, Bolivia, and Ecuador tend to share a lot of similar things for that reason.
Awesome. Well, can you tell us a little bit more about some famous dishes from Bolivia?
Honestly, the first one that came to mind right now is sopa de maní. So that's like peanut soup. And so a lot of times when people are new to Bolivian food, I will kind of show our common like a rice stew or kind of a meat stew dish or like a fish soup, just to introduce them to Bolivian food slowly. And then once they're like, okay, give me something new, something that I probably never heard of, I'm like, okay, let's do peanut soup. So that is a famous dish and that you might not see often. And then it's garnished actually with French fries. So it's like very thin French fries that are garnished on top, which is unique because if you look at the influence here in the US, there are a few states like Pittsburgh, for example, that tries to have like a famous salad or something. I recently found out that the thing that makes it unique is they do the garnish with French fries. And I was like, oh, this is very Boliviano of them because we do the same thing with a lot of our dishes. We add French fries as the garnish, from soups all the way to salads, all the way to just like a main course meal that you'd be like, why are the French fries on there? And it's like, oh, it's just a
Interesting.
garnish. It's French fries with like parsley. So that's a famous dish that maybe wasn't heard of. But of course, we also have like our own version of like arroz con leche, caldo de pollo, like chicken noodle soup, a beef stew. We have very similar ones in that sense, but they're made slightly different. Or we have empanadas, but we also have salteñas, which are very different. We also have like a lot of desserts from different versions that are unique, that have like influence from Central America all the way to an influence of the Asian side, just because of how immigration kind of happened in the part of Bolivia and part of Peru and a little bit of part of other countries in South America. You had all the people from certain parts of Asia that migrated there. So our food has an Asian kind of influence in one area of Bolivia versus on the south when we see the Italians who came into Argentina, and part of them did migrate up to Bolivia. We also see an influence of an Italian kind of cuisine. Like we have a version that looks like lasagna, but it's not lasagna. And there's like more veggies in there. And sometimes we have eggplant and meat. And any Italian who might be listening would say, like, this is not lasagna, but the influence comes from that. It comes from another Italian dish. So I don't know. Sometimes when I try Bolivian food, I'm always like, oh, I feel like this has an Asian twist to it or a fusion to it. And that feels very like home and famous.
That's interesting how foods develop over time because of, like you said, people migrated. Now we have these influences. It's kind of like a fusion between traditional, or what was traditional Bolivian, and then the cultures that came and made it their own. And now that's a new Bolivian dish. Like it's awesome the way food transforms.
Yeah, yeah, and even like within the country, right? I know Mexico has the same idea and concept. Like, I'm native, and there's different smaller tribes and tribes throughout Bolivia. But if we look at just like the indigenous tribes and the culture in Bolivia, you'll see that we have what is called a chola sandwich, and it got influenced and made really fancy in some of those really fancy restaurants that you can go up in Bolivia that a lot of tourists go to. But the traditional recipe and the dish, it actually just comes from more of the indigenous tribes, that it was really just like, give me some pork, give me the special sauce, almost like it's a Big Mac version, but instead of beef, it's pork, and the bread was toasted and it was made right there and then on a special kind of rock. And a lot of those foods were cooked differently too. So you see them like being served in these high-end restaurants, served in this new version of what is considered like the Bolivian touch or the Bolivian cuisine. But if you look at the history of the dish, it actually comes from like an indigenous tribe that's either still existing or was existing at that time. And I think that's what I found more interesting when I'm like, oh, how do you actually cook the traditional way? And it's like, oh, you cook it like under the ground, and then you put dirt over it, and Mother Nature is cooking your meals, and then after a few hours you essentially dig out your food, and there you go, it's like a home cooked meal. And obviously you can't really do that here in Chicago, where you can't just go to your backyard and dig a hole and put food in there and be like 4 hours later your meal will be ready. There are some limitations, of course.
Yeah. Oh, wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay, well, thank you for sharing about, the famous dishes. Overall, would you say there's certain spices that are commonly used in Bolivian food?
Yeah, and because English is not my first language, the first thing that came to my mind, I will say it in Spanish because I always say it wrong in English, but anyone listening can laugh about it. Canela is the first thing that actually popped to my mind. I don't know if that would be like the number one thing, but canela, or how I say it in English that I know is pronounced wrong, but it takes me a while to get it right, is synonym, right? Yeah. So that's like one that came up first, just because growing up we would use it in everything. We even have like a drink for it. We even have one that we mixed out with peaches, and it's like a drink that you can give to kids and stuff. And my dad would make a bunch and like essentially hydrate all the kids in our building that we lived in, this apartment, and they would all be like, what is this? And I'd be like, it's a Bolivian drink, drink it. And I never knew what it was, but I didn't realize the main ingredient was canela. So we use canela a lot. Oregano is another big one. I feel like any herb you can think of, we use a lot. Bolivia has the biggest witch market in the world. We also have like a lot of influence with a lot of our indigenous tribes for that reason. We're very huge on celebrating Mother Nature, among other stuff. And even those who may not identify as being indigenous, they may have a spiritual connection to it. A lot of people in Bolivia may be Catholic, but they have an indigenous way of living with culturally. And I say that because for that reason, we use so many herbs and spices that I can't even think of all the names on top of my head. And some of them are used in our foods versus some of them are used like potions. Like, here's something that's gonna give you good luck or give you money, give you health. And some of them are used in more of an integrative kind of nutrition medicine approach, where it's like you have an upset stomach, so here, take this. I was born in La Paz, Bolivia, which has one of the highest altitudes. In fact, to fly there, you need a pilot that has, I think it's like 10, 15 years experience. Don't quote me, but they need like a certain amount of experience for it. So flying out there can be expensive. But when you land there, because the altitude is so high, it is very common for people to get sick. And so there is this plant, which is how they make cocaine. And it's the cocaine plant, like the actual plant itself, right? Not the drug. You make a tea out of it, and that tea isn't like used a lot for even tourists and people who live in the altitude are not used to it or have an upset stomach.
Yeah, it was fascinating to hear about the witches. That was really interesting.
You know that about me, although I don't really market it in my business or anything like that. So it's not a service I sell, but A lot of people call me La Brujita, or I interpret dreams, I do the potions, I do all of that. But I don't do that in my business. That's just like my like part of it. But it is what drew me a lot to understand integrative nutrition, like integrative functional nutrition, because it's all over the place and you never know what's true, what's evidence based, or what's something that your great great aunt just made up and it's not real.
I would love to hear about your cultural holidays and what are some foods that are typical for some of your favorite holidays.
Okay. I feel like there's a lot of holidays in Bolivia that are maybe unique to Bolivia, and then some that we all celebrate. So I can talk about two that just came to mind. One that's very common, and I think that's Mother's Day. I think every culture, for the most part, that I know has Mother's Day. But we actually celebrate it not on, I think in Mexico and most Central America, they celebrate it the second Sunday, or is it the
We do
second?
May 10th.
You do May 10th, yeah, and then the U.S. does like the first Sunday or the second Sunday, right?
Something like that. Yeah.
But in Bolivia, we do actually May 27th. So my mom will make us celebrate Mother's Day because in her mind, she's Boliviana, but she lives in the U.S. and we live in Chicago where there's a lot of Central Americans and we have like Central American families. She's like, I should be celebrated 3 times, if not every day. So we do celebrate it 3 times in our household. But I think what makes it unique, the reason we celebrate on a different day is because of the history of what came to be for it. So we celebrate on that day because that was the day that a bunch of moms in Bolivia like got together and they were trying to essentially protest and demand rights against our government. And it was just like protests in a way and against like the military and etc. And all the moms came out and they had like their ollas, like the pots and pans, like as their weapons. And they came out to talk on behalf of essentially their families and their country in many ways. And that kind of battle is kind of what brought this idea of how powerful women can be, but in particular how powerful moms are and how united they can be and how much they'll fight for their children essentially and what is considered their home, which is not just their actual home, like their house, but their country. And so we celebrate Mother's Day on a different day to acknowledge that event of that day of all these moms coming out with their ollas, their pans, anything they can grab to essentially protest. And so on that day, we do kind of cook essentially anything your mom wants, one, which is very common that I hear other people say that they do on Mother's Day. But we also try to cook anything that's traditional. So if your favorite mom's recipe for dessert is arroz con leche, then we're going to do arroz con leche. But let's say she really wanted cheeseburger and french fries, even though that's maybe considered quote unquote more like American food, that is what she would get. And so what is considered the food that we eat on that holiday, it really depends on whatever your mom wants, right? But then we also have some that are super unique that maybe not other countries celebrate, like a la cita, which is technically like Carnival, where you don't just celebrate it on one day, it has many days. But Alacitas does have just one day in January where everything is mini. So imagine just like going to like a festival and everything you see around is like a tiny computer, like a tiny little kitchen, a tiny house, a tiny everything. And the holiday comes from an indigenous tribe where it's thanking the god of abundance. And so there's many everything. You buy whatever you're hoping to get. Like if you want a house this year, you want your business to go well, you can buy those things. They sell food, traditional foods out there that you can eat outside. Everyone's out late at night. But as a kid, I used to love it, and especially the first time I've ever seen it when I was there in Bolivia. Everyone talks to like their family to you. You feel so connected to nature because they're talking about, there's a meditation going on, there's drinks, there's drinking. Everyone talks to you like they knew you for years, and I knew they didn't know me for years because I was like, this is my first time seeing this. And I was definitely that kid who like liked Hello Kitty, like little cute stuff, still do. Like I have like little cute pillows and things like that. And so this holiday is literally a mini of everything. And yes, the holiday goes a little bit deeper when we talk about what we're hoping for, when we're thinking about how it connects to our indigenous roots, when we're thinking about how it connects us all to Mother Nature. But it's also just a time where you can you can buy mini stuff, buy food, kind of get connected to your culture. And it's like a day of relax too. So I feel like a lot of people try not to work on that day. And so that's one that I think is something you only see in Bolivia.
Fascinating. Well, I like that you keep talking about basically functional nutrition, right? How you guys use a lot of like herbs, and you mentioned the story about witches and potions and all of that. What are some foods or herbs or anything in general that they associate in Bolivia with health?
Yeah, I feel like we do have a huge diet culture influence, like many countries do, and some I felt it more than in others. So for that reason alone, I will say, depending where you're at or who you go, people might try to essentially do their best of looking at what they see as healthy, like trying to get more vegetables in their dishes, trying to not put as much meat in there, and those things that you just hear. But growing up, and even when I think of Bolivia, like we have tea time. It's very common for a lot of us to have tea. We value naps and just kind of relaxing and allowing our body to digest. We will also be told you kind of have to eat, and like many Latinos, it's like you're telling me to eat, and now later you're telling me I'm fat. There is definitely a lot of fat phobic diet culture that's implemented, but at the same time, I will say that part of what they consider healthy is the fact that we're able to not just eat to live, but to be connected. So there's this whole idea on what some people might just say is mindful eating. I would argue mindful eating goes deeper than that, but it's acknowledging, hey, the food is here. Let's spread gratitude. Let's think about where it came from. Let's try to absorb all these flavors. And so in Bolivia, sometimes it is the foods you're eating, but also like how you're eating. If you are eating fast and not caring and just eating because you want to get to work and live and do, that can lead to what a lot of people over there might consider not healthy then, because you're not actually taking the time to be connected to the food or to talk to the person next to you. The food is a way to connect people. So there's a value in that. And then as far as the food items, like I see people, even my mom, like if your cramps are bad, like she has a tea for that, if things aren't going well, like mint is used a lot, oregano is used a lot in a lot of different ways. Soups as well, like they'll be like, oh, okay, it sounds like you're dehydrated, you need this kind of soup in here, almost like a balance of hot and cold. And when I think about that, I really see the influence of that coming from the Asian kind of cultures when we think of that difference of hot and cold a lot. But we see that too in certain parts of Bolivia, where they recognize that where you live is important. They also recognize how long it takes to cook. Like La Paz, the altitude is high, so the boiling point is different. So I know in the RD exam, we all had to like learn this stuff and learn how to cook food and all that. But essentially, cooking potatoes here in the US can take like 20 minutes. But in Bolivia, because of the high altitude, that dish that here in the US might have taken max 30 minutes or an hour to cook, over there it takes like 4 or 5 hours to cook. So for that reason, some of the foods that are also considered healthy is not even just, it's just accessibility and how fast it was to cook it, and the fact that like, wow, you made a dish that I know took you 8 hours to make. Like for me, this is healthy because it's showing not only how much you care about your guest, but also just the effort you put in there. And so that adds value to the food. Like all of a sudden that's considered a little bit more healthy too. On the flip side, there is a diet culture influence, but you'll see a lot of Bolivianos say, eat the salad with this, or it's very common. We make our dressings a lot, but growing up, I was very used to my dad who would just like be like no dressing, and so it's just a salad, and I'd be like, okay. And if we added dressing, it was olive oil or just your basic vinegar, nothing too fancy, and that was considered healthy. So you could see a little bit of that diet culture that's in there, and then also recognize that then it became part of our culture. So like anytime I eat a salad, sometimes I do just want olive oil and some vinegar, maybe a little bit of salt, and that's it. I definitely didn't grow up with like a French dressing or Italian dressings. And it's less diet culture to me. It's just more of a cultural thing. Because I know anytime I go to any restaurant in Bolivia, they're going to have your olive oil there, they're going to have your salt shaker there, and they're going to have your vinegar there. And it's kind of just their way of being like, this is the healthier kind of option per se. Or after eating a meal, having some tea, having some coffee. So there are some things that are associated with health, but if you really look at it, it's more of a cultural way of how Bolivianos use food to connect to each other.
Gotcha. I like how you keep bringing up, the themes of health as far as what in your population people try to do to be healthy. What do you think are some challenges that they face in their nutrition care?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think like many South American countries, it is that diet culture influence and that influence of us wanting to be a certain way and look a certain way. And this is not just South America. I've seen other people talk to me about their countries about the same thing of wanting to have lighter skin, like valuing the idea that you don't look indigenous, right? Or that you are not fat. And so there are some stuff like that in Bolivia. And this year I had gone to my partner's home country. They're half Honduras and half Colombiano. And I went to Colombia and I really saw the diet culture there too. And Bolivia over the years also has that influence. So I would say something that really affects the challenges that they're facing in nutrition care is one from the basic access to an RD that may be familiar with trying to go further than just providing weight loss and preventing diabetes. Diabetes is growing in most countries in South America, but it's really taking that depth further. So I think a long time ago, the medical school in Bolivia, the medical school in Peru, in Cuba, they really emphasized this idea of health at every size before, is my argument, honestly. They really valued the idea that if your labs are great, that's what really matters. But now there is this huge push, and even though it was always there, I feel like that push is even spoken louder now about just being skinny and not having diabetes and trying to look essentially as white as possible or American as possible as you can be. So this whole white supremacy capitalist kind of world that we live in, a lot of Bolivia has been affected on that. In Bolivia, a lot of people do go and become dietitians. My aunt's a dietitian, and I never even knew that until I got older. So it is a common field, but many dietitians there don't have, I would argue, the privilege that maybe I have here in the US, that I can talk about different concepts. And they're really just focusing on the hospital. And so there's a lot of red tape around that. And they're not really in all of the communities that are needed. So there was a clinic out in Bolivia that was out in the rural. And if they wanted a dietitian, they were probably going to have to drive over 2 hours to get access to one. And so a lot of people are going where the jobs are at. And politics plays a huge challenge for a lot of people who are in Bolivia. But if you're here in the US, you also face that issue, because as a Boliviano living in the US, you usually get a dietitian who either is white and has no idea what Latinos eat, or maybe you have somebody who assumes that you eat like someone who's from Mexico or something. And that's very different to how we eat. And so then we face that challenge of, yeah, I don't actually eat beans. So I get that you're telling me not to eat beans, but I don't even eat that to begin with. And they may say things like, this Boliviano is from the US and is diabetic. And they told them something similar to that end, like, oh, you're eating quinoa, you're eating produce, right? Like, it sounds like we're eating quote unquote healthy, like a healthy diabetic meal. But they were eating like 5 potatoes in one meal. They were eating a lot of over their starch requirement. And so there was clearly a lot of communication there, and an acknowledgement of like someone saying, actually, I do eat healthy, yes, but how much? So then portions became a question. So I don't know. I guess like the first instinct for me when I'm thinking of the challenges my population face in the US, it's really like who actually knows about our culture. And if you're in Bolivia, honestly, it's the access to nutrition care, and it's the constant diet culture that both, whether you're in the US or Bolivia, you're facing. Even till today, Bolivia, there are some people that still have the shame of being indigenous and would rather say they're Catholic and, hey, my last name has Cortez in it. So there's still this like kind of shame around it. And then in the US, there's also this sense of like loneliness. I think anytime I meet a Boliviano, they tell me how most of their family left or they don't know anyone here. And the community is definitely smaller compared to other Latino populations, especially here, like even in Illinois. But once you hit certain communities, like in New York, like I mentioned, then you realize like, wow, what a big community. And it kind of goes back to the social determinants of health, right? Like what affects nutrition. It's not just the food, it's the access, but it's also our community. And if you are here in the US and you're already struggling to just get day by day, but you don't have anyone that really understands your background, that's going to affect your nutrition care. And there's a reason why a lot of our communities stick together and why we like also find anyone that looks close to us, like, oh, she looks Latina, I'm gonna go and sit next to her, right? But at the end of the day, our foods are still very different, and our requirements and our backgrounds are still very different. And, you know, I met a dietitian who's Indigenous, but she's Indigenous to North America tribe, very different than South America. So even then, even if someone was proud to be Indigenous and was like, yes, I'm Latina, I'm Indigenous and everything, they may still not get the correct nutrition care. And sometimes it's less about the food. I would argue most Bolivianos, like especially if you grew up in Bolivia, in elementary, they teach you gardening, they teach you herbs, they teach you like produce, they teach you what would be considered quote unquote like healthy, they teach you what will raise your cholesterol, they teach kids like how to cook, the history of Bolivia and etc. So as adults, it's actually those other factors that affect our health that really affects nutrition care, like the community aspect, access to insurance, just a job, just feeling like you are being heard or understood. And I know I'm going on a tangent here, but it just kind of all goes back to that. And whether you live in Bolivia or you're in the US or a whole other country, there really is this weird gap to it. And that's usually what affects nutrition care. And then I feel like if my mom was here, like thinking about their story when they came from Bolivia to the US, you know, she also recognized how different the food was here. If you look at other Latino countries, you do see a McDonald's. Bolivia does have some of them, for sure, we do. But some of them didn't thrive because as a country, we didn't like the food. And so a lot of our foods also sometimes are homemade. We do eat pretty local, sometimes out of necessity, like we don't have the money, and sometimes out of the privilege that we just prefer that. So I know my mom mentioned when she came here to the US, she felt like everything had a lot more sugar and a lot more salt. And yet she didn't know where to get food that she liked. And so she was just kind of forced to change the way she ate. And that became one of the barriers for her in her own health journey. And it wasn't until she had an awareness to where she can get maybe some foods and where like the Latino community is that her nutrition care essentially or her health changed, right?
Yeah, I can definitely see how that would be such a huge challenge too, because there's not such a prominent Bolivian community that there's not going to be someone that's going to understand, you know, your foods and how to help you with what you're working with. How do you make sure to be culturally inclusive in your niche? I know you have quite a few specialties. How do you keep that cultural lens?
So I try to one always stay in my scope, right? When we're thinking about just within my scope and how I modify it, I'm very clear sometimes on my limitations. So I try to figure out if any of my identities are going to help the patient that I'm seeing or the family that I'm seeing. So that's one thing I try to kind of keep in mind. Some, you know, some people have gone through medical trauma, some people have gone through medical racism, and sometimes knowing that information can be helpful for me as such, and sometimes not. So I will say in private practice, the advantage I have is I get to create essentially my intake packet and ask some of the questions that I think are going to help me understand where this person's coming from and how I'm going to modify maybe the way our sessions are treated, because I do recognize that sometimes people come to me for the mere fact that they know that I'm not your typical stereotype resident who's supposed to be like tall, white, comes from money, heterosexual. Other than the part that I do identify as a woman, I am short. I am not skinny. I definitely am categorized under small fat. I'm queer, right? I'm Latino. There's so many different things that sometimes I do recognize that patients are coming to me just for the mere fact of that. So sometimes I acknowledge if an identity will be helpful or not, and that's going to modify it. Two, if, you know, I grew up in here in the Chicagoland area, so there's a lot of Puerto Ricans, Mexicanos, Colombianos, a lot of people from Central America. So I learned a lot from just like my personal experience and even traveling, that I know a lot of it. And I was even told when I went to Spain that I speak with a Mexican accent, that I was like, oh, that's not Mexican. But it's for those reasons, sometimes I'm easily able to modify that by saying like, oh, okay, so that's helpful for me to know. But I also don't assume that just because someone is Mexican, maybe they want to be identified that. I actually I had another Latina patient who, similar to me, actually had a different experience growing up. They were a TCK, a third culture kid, and she identified a lot actually with Polish and Russian food. And to me, I was like, okay, cool. So then there's my limitation, but now at least I know what that is. And the German side that she identified with, I was really not familiar. So I just really had to tell straight up like, yes, I know German food, but the food and the dishes you're saying, I have no idea what you're saying. You're basically speaking a whole other language. So I told her, how about you give me food items? And sometimes learning about the ingredients, I'm like, okay, well, now I see where we can go with this. And now we can figure out essentially what is your version of healthy, or what is your definition of health. And then I can figure out how much culturally we'll have to talk about. And sometimes we can do it synced in that moment, right? Like we can talk about how to just adjust things. And sometimes we may have to look at that later on when we're in a better state. Like I do see eating disorder patients, and talking about culture with food is like, we're not there yet. Like first we just need to be in a more recovered state. And then maybe later on we can figure out, does your culture and food connect? Is there some kind of identity in there? Do we even want to explore it? Because I will say, me as a dietitian, I'm like, yes, I want to talk about it. But not everyone does, and not everyone sees it that, like, not everyone will see it that way. And in the recovery area, I also know that's not like always even appropriate, to be honest. Some people struggle with that, and I've definitely had patients with that who have a Latino background, but because of all the diet culture in our community, they just do not want to be identified with any kind of Latino cultural food. They will say they're Latino, but when it comes to food, absolutely not, because it's just too triggering, and that's okay. Like, and then I know that for that patient, I'm going to modify it where we're not talking about that, maybe in time in therapy or whatever they may want to, or maybe they never will, and that's fine too. On the flip side, I've had patients who, same idea, but it was a different culture that they really connected with. So I had a patient who, also Latino, but grew up with, they do that nickname flaca, flaco. So if they see you fat, they call you flaca. And if you're flaquita, they call you gordita or something like that. And so she did not identify, she did not want to talk about Latino food, nothing like that. Absolutely not. But Asian cuisine, in particular Japanese food and Korean food, really, really kind of impacted her in such a positive light that once she was in a more recovered state, we did explore actually those foods, and we kind of learned about it together and explored even like other Asian cuisines like Vietnamese food, because even though she does not identify as Asian food really did bring a better light into her recovery. So I think sometimes modifying it isn't necessarily where you were born or who you grew up with, but even like what actually brings you joy and what is actually bringing you health and making you healthier, essentially. And I don't know if that makes a lot of sense, because I know I'm rambling a little, but that's essentially how I modify it. Like, really depends. Is my patient pregnant, or do they have an eating disorder, or are we just never going to talk about that? And I know you see more renal, and you probably see a lot of diabetes and IBS, and I think on that end, sometimes you do have to talk about some of those foods that you may have to essentially eat less of, or kind of customize it so you're still enjoying food without feeling a restriction. And those are definitely harder. The more clinical you get, it can get hard. But yeah, sometimes culture is involved in food talks, and sometimes it isn't.
That's such an interesting perspective of how, like you mentioned, it can be triggering for some people because of that diet culture that you see in Latino food culture. But thank you for sharing about that.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Well, I love the work that you're doing. And I know you finally started your business Instagram. So I would love for you to tell people how they can find you if they want to work with you.
Yeah, I'm very old school, so who knows? But with high demand of everyone wanting me to make one, yeah, you can. It's at HHW underscore honest health and wellness is the Instagram, or you can do honesthealthandwellness.com, which is the website. You can also just contact me on email, or even whether that's to be a patient or you just want to talk and meet, or you're a Boliviana listening to this and you're like, oh, there's a dietitian that's Boliviana, and just email me. That's going to be my first name, Andrea at honesthealthandwellness.com. I can obviously share you my business like virtual card. I try to make everything as sustainable as possible. And that might be just another way to find me. On the website, I'll tell you like where you can find me or what's the next event. So if you want to have a meal or see me talk, or even just garden with me for a day, like that is opened for anyone to just view and see.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank you again for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I know we had a lot of tech issues, so I really appreciate both of us for being able to do this. I always like going on people's podcasts and talking, and it's always fun to actually support someone who's doing work that you're doing. So I appreciate this podcast. I remember listening to a couple of yours, and I think it's a lot of work. So I think anyone listening to this, like, yeah, I don't know. I guess I just want to say thank you for like creating this space, because it is a lot of work, and we both are very busy people. So I appreciate you doing this for not just the Latino community, but for the nutrition field as well.
Oh, thank you so much. That's very sweet. Well, until next week, that's it for today. Bye, everyone.
Ciao.
A big thank you to my guests for being on this week's episode. If you like what you heard, take a screenshot of this episode and tag us on social. I am at Food Culture Curious on Instagram and TikTok, and we also have a Facebook group called Food Culture Curious Dietitians. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/Food Culture Curious. Or as always, you can support by sharing, following, or rating this podcast. Every click from y'all means the world to me. And now for a quick disclaimer. Food Culture Curious is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not take the place of medical advice from licensed healthcare professionals. If you need to seek medical advice, please speak to your healthcare provider. Thank you for listening.